Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod. Last month, we had a vociferous debate on the question of whether Wellington was better than Napoleon, courtesy of a comment by Bernard Cornwell. At the time that Bernard made that comment, it excited a lot of comment on social media, and our follow-up episode was similarly a cause for controversy. So rather than simply walk away from the debris left by the mic drop / stick of dynamite that we had hurled into the Napoleonic nerd sphere, we decided to actually do something about it. This was always the point of this podcast, to try and get people to have a chat. And so we wanted to respond to some of your comments and keep that conversation going. Joining me, therefore, are the original cast of that extravaganza, the estimable Dr. Luke Reynolds, Esquire, Beau, scholar in residence, all-round memory doctor, wonderful American friend and co-host, of course, of this show. Good to see you, Luke. How are you doing?
Very well, very well. Thank you. Thank you. Actually, thank you to our patrons and our listeners for having such a great discussion about this and allowing us to have a discussion about their discussion about our discussion about the Facebook discussion.
There are lots of comments rather than questions, and lots of questions rather than comments. So
this is what I'm saying. Like, we are training them to be good academics.
We could use that as a tagline for the show, quite frankly. Also in the chat for this one, our much loved quartermaster, Liam Telfer, reenactor, historian, firefighter, veteran, all round kind of the thinking Napoleonic nerds beefcake. There we go. That's a title. How you doing, mate?
I'm well. I'll take it. It made me laugh when you called Luke the American friend, like as if he's like the only one. But we'll not get into that discussion about the discussion until perhaps another day.
We can save that for another episode, maybe, if we're feeling brave enough. Right, where to start with this? We're just going to dive straight in. We've got quite a few of them across Patreon, Spotify, YouTube, and indeed Twitter and Facebook. We'll start with something a little bit military. I think something quite kind of classically Napoleonic. This is from Martin Smith on Patreon, who says, as ever, a joy to listen to. Thank you. One question, though. What difference did their subordinates make to Wellington and Napoleon's relative success? This was a bit of a theme vis-a-vis subordinates that we're going to return to across this and potentially even another episode. So what difference did their subordinates make to their relative success? Napoleon had his pick of a huge array of generals who had proven success with years of combat experience. Was Beresford of Davout? Was Hill Alan? Where was Wellington's Berthier or Murat even? Napoleon could hire and fire at will. How much influence did Wellington actually have at Horse Guards to shape his command team? Stunning question. This is why we do this show, for questions like this. So thank you for that, Martin. Luke, do you want to start us off on this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a spectacular question, right? And it touches on a number of things. It touches on Napoleon's rulership style, never mind his leadership style, all the way down to, how much power did Wellington actually have at this point? Because we're all used to assuming that, we think of Wellington in his sort of office and horse guards days when the British Army did nothing without worrying about his reaction. But when he's in Spain, it's a whole different question, and he has to deal famously at Waterloo with a cavalry commander who's shagging one of his nieces. So this is a fantastic question, and I also love the fact that it brings in the fact that when Napoleon got sick of a commander, instead of firing them, he made them king of a small country somewhere, where they promptly then declared war on him because they realized that he was the greatest threat to European peace. So here's my thing on this. When Wellington becomes prime minister, and we are jumping forward, right? When Wellington becomes prime minister, he trusts Hill with commander-in-chief of the armed forces, which to me makes Hill Wellington's Berthier. I would also argue that based on how the cavalry did, especially at Waterloo, Wellington had more Murats than he knew what to do with.
Yeah, that was exactly my reaction. Pick an officer from the British heavy cavalry. There is your Murat that Wellington has to deal with on many occasions. Sure, that's slightly facetious. Perhaps we can dig a bit more into cover in a moment, but I'm not going to try and steal Liam's thunder there. He is our cavalry correspondent. Um, Interesting argument regarding Hill, um, and Hill potentially being his Berthier. I see where you're going. I've always seen the appointment of Hill as, and this is a slightly harsh judgment, but I often see this as Wellington knowing that Hill will do what Wellington wants.
Mm-hmm.
And it is often said that Hill might have been nominally CNC, British Army, but that actually, if there was anything that required a bit of opinion, Hill would defer to Wellington, or at least would consult Wellington and then implement what Wellington suggested. And that's not to say that Hill isn't a success as CNC. He is. He's very interested in improving standards for soldiers. That's hugely needed. That's hugely welcome.
Mm-hmm.
Hill has his credits as a commander and as a CNC, but I always see it as Hill basically being put in that post because he is Wellington's man and Wellington knows it.
I
I'm not
agree
sure
with that.
I'm not sure that's quite a Berthier thing in
No,
the
but
sense that that relationship's a little bit more symbiotic.
it is symbiotic, absolutely. But where it does match up is that while Wellington makes Hill CNC because he knows that if there's anything important, Hill will come to him, or they'll just discuss it at the club. He also trusts Hill to deal with the day to day.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that stands up. Definitely. As for who's the Devou in that situation, that's a really tricky one. Because you can't credit Crawford as a Devou star. I mean, if you want to pick a Lan, I would hesitantly suggest maybe Crawford is your Lan in that
Crawford
situation.
also could be a nay.
Yes, Crawford is probably much better as a nay. Actually, that's well put. Because of the firiness, but also Crawford has his moments where he screws up a little bit,
Yeah.
particularly at the Koa.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed, Ney on the opposite side of that battle screws
Yeah.
up a bit, having effectively won it. So yeah, that's well put. Who is the Devou in the British Army during this period? Well, the obvious answer to this is that Wellington is the Devou. So where is Wellington's Wellington? Is really what we're asking, and he's trying to find people like that. He's got sort of members of his staff who he's trying to pull up, but I'm not sure he ever finds his Berthier or indeed his mirror image amongst the lower stratas.
But this is the thing, like we were having this conversation about a week ago via chat. In terms of yes, we put Napoleon, Wellington, and Blücher are, in the words of every press corps in the world, the three great captains of the age, quote unquote. That overlooks the fact that one of them is an emperor, right? By political strength in 1815, 1810, 1812, Wellington is a marshal. He's not Napoleon. And by that argument, then the Napoleon becomes like what, half the Prince Regent and half the Duke of York, which is a horrifying amalgam of privilege. Um, there is a genuine argument to be made here that Wellington, as you say, like is not the emperor. He's a marshal in terms of political power, in terms of military numbers commanded. Wellington, yes, Wellington does, especially when you get into 1813, 1814, he's thinking about all of Europe, but he doesn't have to. He's doing that because he's good at his job, not because he's ruling a country.
And as I suspect we mentioned in the first installment of this double bill, when presented with power of state, Wellington surrenders command of the army, not because he wants to, but because he recognizes that it's politically expedient.
Yeah. Although there is an example of an early Waterloo dinner that takes place at Downing Street.
I mean, firstly, shocked that you managed to bring us onto Waterloo banquets. But that is curious. It doesn't surprise me, but that is
Yeah.
curious. Liam, we've basically pushed you in the corner and refused to let you talk for the first 10 minutes of this. Apologies. Let us know your thoughts on this, please.
Well, firstly, I think it's difficult to perhaps put Hill in that kind of Berthier chair. And I know you talk about the relationship between Wellington and Hill as C&C, but I mean, Hill doesn't take over that job till what, like 13 years after Waterloo? And I think that's obviously 13 years of relationship development that we don't necessarily see during the war, during the Peninsular War, or during the conflict in the Low Countries. I mean, the obvious one that sort of stands out on a poll is George Murray being the sort of chief of staff role. And it is so difficult, like we've spoken about, sort of trying to find these crossovers. You know, I think there's elements of Crawford that you'd find quite comparable with Davout, that kind of authoritarian, that very strict, sometimes leading to strained relationships with like sort of, you know, peers and subordinates. But going back to the sort of the chief of staff type role, I think it's just so much more difficult, isn't it? If you're the commander in chief of a theater, yes, it's a huge responsibility, but it's not. You know, it's not, like we've said before, it's not to the degree that Napoleon is reliant on perhaps Berthier in terms of it's translating the will of an empire and emperor into physical manifestation. Now, George Murray or Delancey or any of Wellington's chiefs of staff sort of working down his ADCs have that level of responsibility, right? Like it's graded much more in favor of difficulty towards Napoleon. So I think it's really difficult to find, sort of relatable comparisons. Now, looking at the way Wellington would perhaps pick his staff, he clearly had a lot of control over, we said about he clearly didn't pick his cavalry commander for Waterloo, but he had a lot of control over his ADCs, over the sort of people that are coming into the Adjutant General's Department in general, or the Quartermaster General's Department in general. So I think I don't think he necessarily surrounded himself with sycophants sometimes in a way that people would think. And we all know that Wellington likes to almost portray that he does everything himself in some sort of kind of Wellingtonian vanity that isn't really true, because I mean he's not a superhero. So yeah, I think that's my sort of overall thoughts on this as a whole, but I think it's really interesting to look at those comparisons, but I do think it is quite difficult to land on anything concrete.
There's a beautiful segue there to a whole stream of comments that have come in. Dan Hazelwood on Patreon, replying to Martin, says, Davout, Soult and countless others were in no small part made by Napoleon. Wellington had little inclination to promote people above his perception of their class. Perhaps a fraction harsh, but I've said many times, aping Rory Muir here, that Wellington preferred talent with a title to talent alone. Luke, you want to jump in at this point before we...
I do. I'm not disagreeing with that at all, right? I far be it from me to disagree with Rory Muir. And yes, no, absolutely. Although, in fairness, Wellington did have no patience whatsoever for title without talent in the field.
True.
In Whitehall, fine, whatever. But in the field, absolutely not. But I will say that what this is overlooking in terms of Dan is that Wellington was also very good at making men. He knew how to use his patronage.
And actually, what we haven't acknowledged within all of this is that he has his restrictions. In fact, he writes about this, that he doesn't have the power to reward in anything like the capacity that he would like to. Sure, he sends people back with the dispatches when somebody's worthy of that promotion, because that's one of the ways that he can utilize that patronage. But yeah, it is a good point, actually, that in an age of patronage, he is quite restricted in terms of what he can do. He can pick his team, but not that much. And he has this reduced pool anyway, because anybody who comes out has to be junior to him, and he's not the most senior guy. That's part of the reason why they make him marshal, because then he is one of the most senior officers in the army. He sits in that rank above everybody else. So then they can send out who the hell they like. But there are very talented people who could have and probably would have been willing to serve under Wellington out in the peninsula who couldn't because of this seniority issue.
Yeah. But this is the problem that we're dealing with, right? And overall, I mean, the Commons address this, we've addressed this, right? We're dealing with, in order to put these two on anything like an equal overall footing, we need to take a relatively concentrated imperial career for Napoleon and a much longer military and political career for Wellington. Wellington becomes very, very good at using patronage to raise people when he's back in London. And this is the problem, right? By the time Wellington gets to a certain level that we're talking about, Napoleon is stuck on an island that is, as geographers use the technical term, in the middle of bloody nowhere. Right? So there is this sort of Napoleon's in order to really discuss these together, we need to take Wellington's entire career as an aggregate. But when they're facing each other, in terms of political power, they're nowhere near equal. With a maybe arguable moment at Vienna when Wellington has sort of the ear of the great powers and can suggest and they'll do what he says.
I think it's really interesting as well to look at when we're looking at Wellington, the politician, and I know we're sort of jumping around the various chronologies here. Like culturally, Britain is in a very different place, and just historically, culturally, very different to France. Now, I don't want to get into sort of counterfactuals, but what if Napoleon was trying to do what Napoleon did in Britain in the 1830s? Like, how is that going to be received, or even in France by then? So it's really difficult to compare them politically, I think, as well.
Okay, so we'll diverge from the military. I want to come back to the military because actually there was a great question from Arthur on Spotify that actually probably merits an entire episode in its own right, but I do want to sort of slightly address it before the end of this one. But on YouTube, British American 4321 made a comment regarding our comments on Wellington's political career and said, I sense a lack of knowledge and understanding of Wellington's political career here. Fair enough, your military historian's fine, but put simply and economically, Wellington's political career was absolutely not, quote, a disaster. And this made me go away and think. There are plenty of academics who go, oh, well, I lecture on this and all the rest of it. And it's true, like this is some of the stuff that we teach, but that's not helpful to this discussion. That's not why we're doing this episode.
I think you'll find that I'm a cultural historian, not a military one.
Okay.
That's where I'm going to get angry at this. It's not like, do I know?
You mislabel me?
Yeah, exactly. Do I know about the political career? We'll put that to the side. Don't mislabel me.
Military cultural military.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. So
as my advisor put it in one of his books, the military sartorial complex.
That's quite a nice one. You should write a paper on that at some point. So this made me go away and think quite a lot in terms of what we'd said and also kind of put different arguments and perceptions. And I was trying to sort of wrap my head in terms of what's the argument that Wellington's career was really quite successful. And I can see where British American is going with this because perhaps disaster is too strong. I thought actually we had kind of acknowledged that Wellington as a statesman he was devoted as a statesman and he was an asset to the British state, particularly in a diplomatic capacity. That's where he excelled. But it's vis-a-vis his time as Prime Minister where really things are difficult to justify. I did the inevitable thing that you always do when it comes to trying to assess Wellington's life and career, which is I reached for Rory Muir's 2-volume biography, which at the end of the section on Wellington's premiership has a very nice kind of several-page summary of Wellington's career, which is I'm going to take a slightly lengthy extract here, but I think it's a slightly kinder summary than I would personally have given, but I think it puts some really interesting thoughts down. So have a listen, folks, and again, come back to us on all of this. So this is quoting Roy Muir, Volume 2 of his biography on the Duke. It's entitled Wellington, Waterloo, and the Fortunes of Peace, 1814 to 52. And this is page 399 to 400, if you want to verify that I'm not chatting twaddle.
Of the hardback.
Of the hardback. Thank you, yes. Rory writes, in less than 3 years in office, Wellington's government had introduced a series of, inverted commas, progressive, inverted commas, reforms, and, inverted commas, improvements, of which any later Liberal administration would have been proud, and which few could match. The repeal of the Test and Corporation Acts, Catholic emancipation, Peel's overhaul of the criminal law, the creation of the Metropolitan Police, and a significant reduction in taxation paid for by strict attention to the economy. At the time, and since, Wellington has received little credit for these measures, because it was felt that they were introduced despite, not because of him, and if anything ran contrary to his real wishes. To some extent, this is fair. He was not a Liberal or even a reforming Tory like Peel, nor was he a rigid Conservative. His work at the Ordnance showed his commitment to administrative reform in pursuit of efficiency and economy. His support for the creation of the police was sincere, and he came to see the necessity of Catholic emancipation long before he became Prime Minister, even though he was rightly sceptical of the claims made by its proponents. He also failed to receive the credit to which he was entitled for his conduct of foreign affairs, especially his cool handling of the Eastern question and the revolutions in France and Belgium. Here he succeeded in his objectives of returning Britain to the heart of Europe and restoring good relations with the Eastern powers. The cooperative climate he fostered helped ensure their relatively calm reaction to the overthrow of the Bourbons in Paris, and this in turn paved the way for the negotiated solution to the problems caused by the Belgian revolt. Wellington was not a great Prime Minister. He did not, as Prime Minister, preserve the nation in the hour of danger or lead her to victory against all odds. He did not dominate politics for a generation or transform the nature of the British state. And he did not strike a particular bond with the populace so that he came to represent and articulate their hopes and desires. But his reputation, like Lord Liverpool's, has suffered from the sharp shift in political outlook and attitudes which affected the British press and part of the public in the 1820s and 1830s, and which led them to dismiss, almost with contempt, those who did not share their new-found certainties. Wellington may not have been a great Prime Minister, but he was one of the leading politicians of his generation, shrewd, confident, and determined, but also flexible and realistic in both his goals and methods, and entirely comparable with Canning, Castlereagh and Perceval, or Grey, Melbourne, and Peel. There's a lot to deconstruct there. Luke, I'm going to let you come in first on this. What are your thoughts?
I mean, honestly, listen, Muir, with the benefit of what, a decade of research, roughly, obviously has more, look, we are fundamentally, we know our stuff, but we're also talking instinctively in a way that if you're writing, you have the benefit of going back and editing. And I will say he is more up on Wellington than we are in terms of this. And that's fair enough. I will grant that. And listen, my enduring respect for Wellington as a politician comes from the fact that even in the aftermath of the Great Reform Act, when he has seen Britain fundamentally transformed politically into something that he would not want, he continues to show up. He continues to work. He continues to support causes. And while, yes, he is staunchly on one side of that divide, he doesn't throw a tantrum. He doesn't try to shut down the government. He doesn't do anything like that. He keeps working in a way that modern politicians on both sides of every aisle, to be clear, I'm not being biased here, could learn from, right? And that is where my respect for the man in a political context comes from, along with, yes, Catholic emancipation and et cetera, et cetera. So yes, I mean, look, the man is not, he's not a Lord Sidmouth, right? And which is damning with faint praise if ever there was any. but he doesn't stand there with Peel or Disraeli or Gladstone, right? And I think he knows that too, right? When he's his second premiership of all of what, a month, he's called to the king, and the king says, I need a prime minister," and he says, "I will do this until Peel gets back into the country, because he is the man you want." And that again is something I respect him for, because a lesser politician would have been like, "Yes, I can do this."
Yeah, this is where he demonstrates that he's not a Napoleon, right? He's not after power for power's sake. He recognizes that the world has moved on. He learns some of the lessons, perhaps, of his premiership, that his vision, his fundamentally much more ancien regime kind of instincts, I guess, are not the way that the country wants to shift. And that if he tries to force that, there's going to be revolution. And if there's anything Wellington despises, it's full-scale, unbridled revolution. So there's always that instinct of the need to preserve the state within him. Perhaps, as you say, we spoke off the cuff, and perhaps I spoke too harshly in describing him as a disaster. I would need to go back and listen to precisely the comment and see the context within which I made it. But I still don't see Wellington's political career as successful. So, I mean, we won't keep coming back to these and keep making episodes out of this, but British American, if you're listening to this, I would be keen to hear you kind of elaborate on what you feel are the sort of the strengths of Wellington's political career, and we can continue that discussion via comments on YouTube. But thank you for putting that forwards. Liam, what about you? Are you kind of inclined to see a case for Wellington as a good prime minister, an adequate prime minister?
Not particularly, and here's for why. I'll be honest. Prior to us really sitting down and talk about it, my level of knowledge pretty much ends in 1815. But borrowing a few of the basics. But one of the things I wanted to do, and when we're talking about remembrance and legacy and stuff like that, I think you're absolutely right to reach for more. But I think it's also really important to speak to people on the street, as it were, speak to the sort of, to just general folk. Like, what do you remember about the Duke of Wellington? Because that's what remembrance and legacy is, right? It isn't about the few, it's about the mass. And pretty much everyone I spoke to, and regardless of how correct they are in terms of their academic knowledge, remember Wellington as a pretty terrible prime minister, and it's purely down to his opposition to the Reform Act. And I think that's what garners that kind of, I guess, hatred's probably too strong a word, but almost that kind of Thatcher-esque opposition we see amongst working class people in particularly older working class people in the country today. And I think that's really important to consider as part of this. Yes, it's not necessarily, it sounds really bad. It's not necessarily factually correct, but it's what's factually correct in the mind of the masses, dare I say. And I think that's a really important thing to add.
Yeah, it is, because there is the thing about interpretation is it's always going to be a case of what do you as an individual regard as being more significant compared to other factors. This is why history is never set. This is why interpretations are always changing. Because I can turn around and say, actually, Catholic emancipation is the most important thing ever to happen in the history of this country. Wellington helps facilitate it, and therefore he's the greatest prime minister ever. Now, that's not a view that I hold, but somebody else, perhaps of, Catholic, descended from a Catholic family, might actually feel very strongly about that because that is their perspective. And that's fine. Like, you're entitled to that opinion. And others will turn around and say, well, actually the most important thing to happen during Wellington's administration was, let's say, the creation of the Metropolitan Police, the peelers. And I've had this argument vociferously with commentators on the Napoleonic era that Wellington does not deserve the credit for that, because that is Peel's reform. That's why they're called the peelers. Right. And sure, Wellington doesn't get in the way of it, but not getting in the way of it is not the same as being responsible for it. The vision doesn't come from Wellington. Peel's been working on ideas around this and other reforms, like all the way back from 1812. So this is something that it's a hill that I will die on, that Wellington doesn't deserve credit for the reforms that are fundamentally Peel's vision and Peel's brainchildren. And people are welcome to disagree with me and have done. And this is where you'll get those differences in perspective, which is why I enjoy like these kinds of discussions. This is why we do what we do, because it's okay to disagree on this. Like there isn't a right or wrong answer to this, and that is part of the fun. I'm going to stay with British American actually, because there was an interesting comment here that often comes out when you start talking about Wellington versus Napoleon. And British American says this got weirdly anti-British and pro-French in a hurry. Come on, guys, we all know that you're impeccably academically impartial here, but don't try so hard to avoid accusations of pro-British bias next time. And I find this really interesting because whichever way you spin this, whichever side of the fence you come down on any discussion about these guys, you will get accused of either being taken in by British propaganda, or if you're critiquing Britain during this period, accused of being anti-British. And I'm not sure it's as clear a kind of binary divide as people tend to sort of assume with this. I've always viewed patriotism as taking a very kind of level-headed look at the good and the bad of a country's present and past, and then looking at how we can build upon that to improve the future. That's my vision of patriotism. Now, other people will and do take very different approaches. For some people, patriotism is sort of unswerving loyalty and cheering Rule Britannia at every kind of turn in the pages of the history book. That's not for me. And I do find it interesting that if you start to come down on the Napoleon side of things, then you're being pro-French and anti-British. Even the French, in many cases, are not pro-Napoleon. Michael Brewer talks about this very eloquently on the Napoleonic Quarterly, kind of saying that actually within France, like, Napoleon is not particularly popular, even at the time, far less today. So I'm always kind of curious about why people sort of feel that this is kind of the issue at stake, that it's about being pro-British or pro-French. And for me, it's kind of not. You can acknowledge the bad on both sides, as I think we do a lot on this show. And I suppose a lot of my perspective is very much skewed by the fact that when you look at the conversations that tend to happen amongst the public, actually there is a much more this is our national story slant to this, particularly in the English speaking sphere of all of this. You know, it can very easily slide towards the Rule Britannia narrative, as I call it. Now, Luke, I'm going to come to you first on this as somebody who doesn't have a dog in the fight, being American. What's your kind of perspective on all of this?
This is more than anything, and I think this is fundamentally a function of the fact that this is an Anglo language podcast and audience, right? Or a English language, be that American, British, Australian, New Zealand, Canada, etc. But I think fundamentally what this is above all is the most dangerous portion of that long-standing assumption that the Napoleonic Wars were above all Britain versus France. Whereas Prussia, Austria, and God's sakes, Russia have entered the chat, right? This is look, it's the same problem that this is going to get me. This is going to get me fan mail, I'm sure. It's the same thing. We do the same thing with World War II, that Britain and America won World War II. No, the Russians won World War II. The Soviets, 90% of German casualties were on the Eastern Front against Russia. in the Second World War. It, it, it what we're talking about fundamentally is my book. What we're talking about is a 50-year campaign by Britain to make Britain the great center of the Napoleonic Wars. That worked. On a level, by the way, that Napoleon would have looked at and said, yeah, that's genius. Because the man knew how to manage his image better than almost anyone else. You can be... This is not a choice. This is not good versus evil. This is not black and white, right? This is a color wheel. And yes, you've got the red of the Britain and the blue of France, but you also have the gray of Prussia. You have the dark green of the Austrians. The dark green of the Russians. The white of Austria, right? You've got all of these colors, and this metaphor is getting very, very strained. But this is, we talk about, this is Wellington versus Napoleon, and then we're like, okay, well, we need to talk about Napoleon, and then we're like, great, Jena, Austerlitz, where are the Brits? Leipzig, where are the Brits? Okay, yes, there is one troop of rocket cavalry. That's it. Did Britain finance these wars? Yes, to a very large extent. I'll give them that. Was there trade? Was there navy? An important part? Yes. But this is not just a Britain versus France fight. Britain and France are on opposite sides of every war for about 100 years, yes. And therefore that becomes this sort of second 100 years war style thing. But this is so much more than that. This involves so many more countries than that. And to distill it down to either or is doing a huge disservice to the historiography. It's doing a huge disservice to the thousands, to the millions of people of other nations that fought and died, that suffered. And also, I reject the idea that you have to choose a side here. Right? I can support the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man while condemning the terror. I can support Catholic emancipation and the Great Reform Act while condemning enclosure and the Corn Laws. Every single country we're talking about at this moment, just like every single country today, has flaws. Right? What I think makes a case that Britain is doing reasonably well in this period, besides the fact that it is monetarily very successful, that it is riding the Industrial Revolution, although the amount of suffering that is built on is an entirely different, not just episode, but podcast. But one thing I will say, fair play to the UK about, is that they have people standing up in Parliament saying, this is a bad idea. We should not be fighting these wars. We should be worrying about other stuff. This is wrong. And they're not being arrested, hunted down, thrown out of the country. Whereas historians writing unbiased views of Napoleon's battles are being kicked out of France. Right? So if I'm going to praise Britain for one thing in this period, it's actually going to be a certain modicum of freedom of press and freedom of expression if you're of a certain class and wealth distribution.
And provided you steer clear of mentioning the king at all.
And provided you steer clear of mentioning the king in any capacity, and the queen, and the Princess Charlotte, etc., etc. But I will say, right, like as I said to you, Zach, when we first talked about this, Britain invented the phrase His Majesty, Her Majesty's loyal opposition. And that is one of the single most important contributions to democracy. The idea that you can be entirely for your country, that you want it to succeed, that you are working to make it to succeed, while still saying, this is not the best way to make it succeed, or I feel that this is a mistake. That is an idea that I will go to bat for in any country at any point. But I reject this either or, black or white, because, damn it, Prussia, Austria, and Russia were involved in this. India was involved in this. Hawaii was involved in this. But I mean, this is not, this cannot be distilled down to Britain versus France.
Yeah, in fairness, we have been guilty of kind of leading a discussion towards that by picking Wellington versus Napoleon, right? This is what Bernard Cornwell set us up for. But the point is well made that um, you're absolutely right. You know, if you start in certain circles, and I'm not saying that this is where British American is going with it, but in certain circles, if you start saying, look, the Peninsular War is not the be all and end all of the Napoleonic Wars, some very angry people start to come out and sort of decry that this is not so. You know, Battle of the Nations kind of suggests otherwise. The Russian campaign again is a very powerful counter argument to all of that. And sure, we can be accused on this show of a degree of Anglo exceptionalism. You know, there is a reason that we are working on a Russia series, amongst other things, a Germany series. But yeah, Liam, let me get your take on this. As somebody who's been inside the British military and who has probably seen a whole plethora of interpretations on this, what's your take on it all?
I mean, it won't be sort of surprising for you all the listeners to hear. I think it is quite simple. I mean, first of all, I agree with everything Luke has said there. The honourable gentleman is right. The British did an incredible job of pumping out this propaganda and this just absolute aura, almost like, you know, like an invisible gas in the air that everyone breathes in. And over the last 200 years, this bias isn't just sort of ingrained; it's just part of our DNA as British people, and you have to really consciously fight against it to sort of to get past that, right? So that is very difficult to do. I think also when you're creating content in a way that we do, we have to have these debates of, you know, we make it kind of black and white in order to make it accessible, to make it digestible. So there is always going to be you have to get off the fence sometimes a little bit, and you have to kind of not necessarily ignore, but see beyond the nuance in order to pick a side. And whether that be pro-French or pro-British, pro-Russian, pro-Austrian, you know, anti-American, whatever it might be. Apologies, Luke. Whatever it might be, in order to create good content and content that kind of has a cyclical nature, we have to kind of hop off the fence and pick a side, even though we all know that it isn't quite as set as that. Otherwise, we would just do every episode for all time, sort of, you know, just waffling about stuff without ever kind of coming to any strong conclusion or opinion.
Yeah, I think there's also a point here that historians traditionally, if they're going to engage in what academic historians would call public history or popular history, there's a lot of trying to play whack-a-mole with mythology. We're going to quick fire some comments in just a moment, and you're going to see exactly a demonstration of that, in that there'll be some takes that have been kind of added in here that really don't kind of reflect the historical reality. And a lot of what historians try and do is go, look, it's not black and white, it's many shades of grey. Like, never mind 50 shades of grey. All history is like 15,000 shades of grey, which makes for a very different kind of type of literature, believe you me. And what certainly I end up being very mindful of is the Peninsular War British exceptionalism crowd, the sort of the people who have perhaps stopped reading when they finish reading the Sharps books, which I get, but you get those are a sort of a hero story that are trying to sort of excite you and take you in a particular direction, and the history ends up being much more complex. See our comments on Copenhagen, on Baderhof, etc., etc. And I think it is important for us to acknowledge the two sides of the debate, and inevitably, you know, we're going to be influenced by our perspectives. It's not necessarily about being anti-British or being pro-French. Sometimes it's just like, yeah, there's a lot of really unpleasant stuff that's happening here, and we should acknowledge that. And that's always fundamentally at my core. Some quick fire comments now. Firstly, on Facebook, Drew Burkmeyer says a better comparison is Wellington and Davout. Drew, I'm going to put a pin in that because we are literally planning an episode that deals with exactly that question. But it's a great thought. We were thinking the same thing. And that has basically emboldened us to go, actually, no, yeah, we should probably move that episode up the agenda in terms of production.
I will say, in fairness, that he is not the only person that has made that argument that we should actually be looking at Wellington versus a Marshal, not Wellington versus Napoleon.
Yeah, fully agree with that. On Twitter, Wacko Montley says Wellington was literally against the ropes and would have lost Waterloo if it weren't for the Prussians. Deep sighs all around the room. Lots of affection, Wacko Montley. If you're listening to this, I'm not sure. Well, if you've listened to the show regularly, you'll know that we sort of come out in hives when somebody makes these comments. The whole point of Waterloo is that Wellington knows the Prussians are coming. It is literally part of the plan. In fact, 2 days earlier, the original plan for Quatre Bras and Ligny was that Blucher was going to stand on the defensive, and then Wellington was going to be the cavalry coming over the hill, both literally and metaphorically. It's a fight combined mentality. It's a continuation of the strategy that the Allies used to defeat Napoleon in 1813 and 1814. It's not about him being on the ropes. It's about the fact that he is sitting there as bait, keeping Napoleon occupied until the Prussians arrive. That is the plan. Sure, the French very nearly break through regardless of that, but it's not really as simplistic as the Prussians saved Wellington, because if the Prussians weren't coming, Wellington wouldn't have stood and fought at Waterloo in the first place. Gents, anything you want to add in relation to that?
It's an Allied victory. It's a coalition victory. There you go.
I have nothing to add other than I concur with you both.
And also, it doesn't take anything away from either side that it's a coalition victory, which is quite often, I think, where people get very twitchy about this. They feel that it's somehow lessened because two armies of different nationalities work in conjunction. And yet, if it had been a corps under Hill that had come sweeping round the French flank and hit Plancenoit, then actually it would have been all about Wellington's genius in kind of pulling this strategy together. The genius still stands, both owed to both Blucher and Wellington. Like, there is a plan here. It works very well.
Yeah. Is D-Day less of a triumph because it's got British, French, American, and Canadian troops, never mind Anzacs, and free Poles, and free, the point stands.
Yeah. Now, I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce this Twitter handle. Perwer Sinjidi. I'm sure that's an acronym for something. It says, fascinating episode. Never thought I would see Dr. White standing up for Napoleon. Well, you and me both there. Switch 1050 says, the impression I get is that Napoleon was obviously a great soldier, but reckless and leaving too much to chance. Whereas Wellington was a great soldier, not quite as good as Napoleon perhaps, but far more sensible and cautious in the end, and beat Napoleon's recklessness. I'm largely on board with elements of that. But again, we're at danger of kind of making this out to be that the reason Napoleon loses is because the British exist and are a thing. And again, the Russians, the Austrians, the Prussians, etc.
Napoleon gets addicted to great crushing victories. He has, early on in his career, he has Austerlitz and Jena virtually back to back, or Jena Auerstadt back to back. And for the rest of his life, fundamentally, he is an addict chasing that high.
There's a great paper in there
There
about
is.
the addiction of victory.
Yeah, and I may very well write it. At which point Ed Koss will never talk to me again because I didn't ask him to co-write it with me. But that is what I've always said, and I will stand by that. It may not be the most traditional or the most sort of politically correct viewpoint, but so much of what brings down Napoleon is to a certain extent Napoleon's own fault because he's chasing that. And in fairness also, because he's gotten France to a certain extent addicted to that kind of victory. And he knows that he needs to keep that up to remain that level of power.
Where I would agree with Switch, though, is Spain. The Waterloo campaign. These are examples of recklessness. Napoleon is taking a risk, doesn't calculate that risk correctly. knows that there are going to be costs associated with it. That you can make the recklessness argument, but it's an argument that's fundamentally an arc from the Peninsular War through to Waterloo that again kind of speaks to this idea that there is more to this than just Britain versus Napoleon. Liam?
Yeah, I kind of want to jump in here and sort of go, okay, what is Napoleon and or Wellington, being reckless about and leaving to chance? I think the benefit of hindsight gives us so much more depth in terms of their risk appetite or their risk aversiveness in terms of moving troops, fighting troops, picking locations, etc., etc. I think in the moment, you don't leave anything to chance. You just don't know it because it hasn't happened yet, if that makes sense. So I think the kind of looking at, Napoleon as being reckless, I think is something we can only do from this viewpoint, because in that moment, he wouldn't, knowing the general that he was, particularly early in his career, he wouldn't have done something knowing that, I'm going to do this because I know it's going to fail. Like, who would do that, right? You're like, yes, there is an element of risk, but I have the appetite for that risk because I have faith in my subordinates, or I have faith in my ground, I have faith in my troops, etc., etc. And the same argument for Wellington. He wouldn't do something if he knew it was going to fail. He wouldn't have held the ridge at Mont Saint Jean if he knew the Prussians weren't coming. He wouldn't have held there if he didn't think he could in time for the Prussians to arrive. So the recklessness thing is, I think it's a really difficult handle to kind of get inside our heads. But as a military commander, it's more of an appetite for risk than it is like just barefaced recklessness. And I think we only get that through hindsight, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I suppose there's an argument to be made here that where we see Napoleon being reckless is in terms of if you want to sort of very pithily summarize the sort of bigger geostrategic stuff that he does, the Peninsular War, the overreach there, the decision to go ahead and invade Russia with all of the logistical challenges that represents. Those are moments when you can kind of summarize, bring that down and say, if you want a single word for it, maybe it's recklessness. Perhaps you and I, and gents, you're welcome to disagree with me here, might call it unrealistic imperial overstretch. Like, it doesn't roll off the tongue anywhere near as effectively. Is that fair? Like, I don't know. It's not for me to put words in the mouth of Switch here, but I wonder if that is what we would kind of use as a way to describe this, and whether kind of we're just finding different words for a problem here.
I think we're looking at a bigger picture than Switch is arguing, and I don't mean that in an offensive way at all. But your definition of recklessness there is bad statecraft on a level that I don't think he's talking about. Where I think he's talking about, and I agree, is not recklessness as Liam does. It's almost it's an élan, actually, more than anything else. It's knowing when to go all in, right? I trust my troops to hold at Jena till I can get my forces there. I trust land to hold at Friedland until I can smash my army into the left flank of the Russians, their army, in one day. Like, it's that kind of thing. It's knowing when to roll the dice in a way that yes, he had absolute trust in his subordinates. B, he had absolute trust in the army that he'd created and the system that he had not invented, but to a certain extent perfected and trained France better than it had been in, and then just went for it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And also it isn't just about knowing when to go all in. It's when you're bluffing, it's being able to hold that poker face, isn't it? And really kind of and bluff your way out, or indeed encourage your enemy to make those kind of mistakes. The classic is Austerlitz, right? He's sort of bluffed the Russians into thinking one thing when he's doing something completely different. I think it's really interesting when recklessness, I guess, to me means something a bit different, perhaps from a military context. It sort of shows maybe careless abandon or something like that. But then again, like you say, it could be termed as bad statecraft and imperial oversight. Your Majesty, there has been an imperial oversight. We have lost the army in Russia. Like, it's a hell of an oversight.
That's put us in our place. I mean, this is why we have you on the show, Liam. Like, that military perspective is is really useful and interesting. There's another comment that came through on Twitter, very small comment, but it says a lot. And I think we'll spend a bit of time unpacking this. JJ Landry says, there's never been an equal to Napoleon. Even the greats like Alexander and Caesar fall short. Napoleon has been in contact with us, probably through some kind of medium, and thanks you for doing his propaganda for him. JJ Landry, I say that facetiously, genuinely, thank you for commenting. But I think this is what Napoleon wants us all to think. Right? He would never actually say that. What you've done is sort of taken the quiet bit of how Napoleon tries to position him and actually said it out loud. Napoleon, as somebody who'd studied Alexander and Caesar, who in some respects tried to model himself, or at least sort of envisioned himself as at least a successor, if not an equal, would have loved that, would have wanted people to make that comparison. But I'm not sure it holds together. And I'm no huge fan of Alexander or Caesar. I'm ambivalent on both of them. But I just don't see that, for one thing, there's nothing that endures about Napoleon's military success. The code fundamentally is what endures. That is an enduring legacy. Sure, there are other reforms, and that's all well and good. But it doesn't feel as though that's where JJ is going with this. It feels like it's much more of a sort of a military-esque thing. Now, you can never really compare Austerlitz to a Cannae or whatever battle you want to pluck from history and sort of say, is this an equivalent? It doesn't work like that. They're different eras, different thoughts in terms of strategy, different pressures in terms of logistics. Like, there is so much there. The only thing that unifies battles across millennia, which is the distance fundamentally that we're talking about here, is the fact that people end up dead at the end of them. And ultimately, the way that you make people dead is by sticking some kind of hole in them through which they bleed. Now, Liam, you may well completely disagree with me on that, but I've always maintained that if you're trying to compare, I don't know, Scipio to Lan or whatever, that doesn't work. I mean, look, we're struggling to compare Lan to Hill, whoever it might be. And so I've never kind of bought this idea that if you take huge tracts of time, literally 1800 years, and try and make these comparisons, that it even works. Like, Napoleon is the Napoleon of his age. That's a hugely unerudite thought, but I just don't see the comparison working. And like, Napoleon sort of tries. He has his Alexander the Great moment. It's called the Egypt campaign, and a guy called Nelson comes along and basically tears up that playbook and goes, no, you're not doing that. And so ultimately, what does Napoleon have to do? He has to abandon his army and run back home.
Yeah, I sort of agree and don't agree. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. For Napoleon to be sat in the room with Caesar and Alexander, and particularly the thing that comes to my mind is all that iconography, the eagles and whatnot. Like Caesar would be sort of clapping his hands just as much as Napoleon would be. Sorry, but I think actually when it's very, very difficult to draw straight comparisons, you're right. But I think from a slightly more sort of nuanced point of view, you can draw parallels. I mean, I can't necessarily do it for Alexander or Caesar in a sense of comparing them to anyone Napoleonic, purely because I don't have any authority on which to sort of talk about them. But just in terms of their, relationships with subordinates, relationships with statehood or statecraft, use of logistics. Now, yes, the means are very different. You famously say, what is it? History doesn't repeat itself, but patterns of human behavior do. So I think in terms of militaristic behavior, how you deploy troops, yes, tactically, clearly very different. Alexander isn't running around with 12-pounders and flintlock muskets. But there are kind of comparisons that can be made. I just can't make them. So I think that with a study, knowing all the facts on the table, I think comparisons could be drawn. Whether or not that we can compare them to the same level, whether we look at someone like, I think it's really difficult again. But I think comparisons can be drawn militaristically, if that makes sense.
I mean, my counter to that would be, you can look at the influences. So you can look at, and people should look at, the influence of Caesar or Alexander on Napoleon. I don't know. I've just never kind of bought the concept. Sometimes I think there's there's a danger that because they are so separate in terms of the environments within which they operate, that ultimately the comparisons become quite kind of wishy-washy. And um sure, you can kind of turn around. Go on, Liam, go on.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like the source material is key here, isn't it? And again, you've got to fight through any kind of bias that's been sort of implemented or written in through that source material. But just in terms of sort of human relationships, whether that be with antagonists or with allies, there are comparisons that can be drawn, if that makes sense. I just don't know if necessarily I'm not the man to do that.
Okay, yeah, no, that is fair. And what I was literally about to say is that you could kind of look at statecraft, I get, and the interrelation between Caesar as military leader versus Caesar as politician, and how does one influence the other. And there, there are certainly lessons to be learnt, and comparisons that you could make. Luke, let me get your take on all of this.
And when Alexander saw the breadth of his domain, he wept, for there were no more worlds to conquer. First of all, Attila the Hun enters the chat. You want to talk about successful military geniuses? Um,
Genghis Khan.
Genghis Khan, yeah. So here's the thing, right? Of those two, I would argue actually that Alexander is the better comparison because Caesar crafts a state that lives on, despite all the iconography. Yeah, no, I think Zach, you said it really, really well. This is Napoleon's propaganda in full force. He would be utterly delighted. This is the Twitter comment version of the Waterloo Museum. With all the chess pieces of the monarchs, and then this giant portrait of Napoleon that's 3 stories tall, dominating it all. Okay, first of all, I hate to say this, but in all due respect to JJ Landry, if you are the type of person who says that on Twitter, then nothing we say is going to make a difference. That is your view. You have the right to that opinion. We disagree with it. I certainly disagree with it. I will also say, from a historical point of view, that this is an unfair comparison because the critiques of Caesar and Alexander have had a millennia to disappear, whereas we've got most of the historiography on Napoleon. That's from a purely historical point of view. You know, we all have our favorites. We all have the greats. Um, I will not argue with you that Napoleon was a great commander. Uh, I don't know who the greatest military commander on earth has been. That's too complicated a question. It's too broad a question. I'm pretty sure if you gathered, if you put sort of Alexander Mikaberidze and Richard Overy in the same room, they would not be. They'd be sort of look at you and go, "You want me to do what now?" Right? Yeah, this is a very, very complicated one, uh, and one that is just this takes what we've been doing to an entirely new level. And I'm gonna finish there before someone takes a hit out on me.
I think it's sort of it's too simple, isn't it? It's sort of it downgrades these people into sort of a game of top trumps, and it's just sort of not possible with any sort of nuance.
Yeah, that's very well said, actually. That yes, there's a sort of an element of sort of mathematical top trumps. You can put a definite number on some of these things, and somebody is comes out best, which is kind of not really what we aim to do with this show. We like to sort of make things complicated. Um, Now we are running out of time. I don't think we'll make a double episode of this. Though if you're desperate for us to continue to discuss your comments, we certainly will indulge that. But I did want to pick up a comment made by Peter Webb on YouTube, who really kind of hit back at us for our critiques of Wellington, and he goes, right. I'd back Wellington against his critics. How many of his critics have had to campaign an army with all of the constraints and consequences that Wellington faced? How are we supposed to accept the implicit argument that the critics know more about the quality and capability of Wellington's troops than he did? I'm also not sure how the claim can be made that Wellington did not have to fight a battle on which the whole campaign depended, when his whole time in the peninsula was spent with the awareness that Britain did not have another army to replace the one that he had. Any analysis of the consequences of his battle has to account for the consequences of a major defeat that got his forces so badly cut up that a complete withdrawal was decided upon, whether through military necessity or politics. It is one thing to talk about his ability to get on boats or take refuge behind the lines of Torres Vedras, but that begs the question regarding what happened next. The objective of the campaign was not to simply occupy Lisbon, but to drive the French out of the peninsula. Picking on particular battles and claiming they don't change much is to some degree arguing that no one link in the chain matters that much. I'd suggest that by the time of Waterloo, Bonaparte was probably past his best. There are some clear criticisms of his conduct of both the campaign and battle. The campaign, in that he put himself and his army in a position in which everything had to go right. Waterloo, in that he failed to either adequately brief or control his marshals and failed to adequately assess the nature, quality, and disposition of his opponents. Huge amounts to unpick there. We've got some nods on certain aspects of what you said there, Peter, and shakes of the head from some of us on others. I'm going to take the first element of this, which is kind of the social history of the British Army thing, which is one of my things that I kind of feel I vaguely know what I'm talking about. How do we accept the implicit argument that we know the quality of Wellington's troops better than he did? For the simple reason that we know what he says about them, and then we can empirically show that it's not the case. Things like scum of the earth being the most obvious of these. The idea that the British Army consists of the pickings of prisons, who are these irredeemable people who need to be flogged within an inch of their life. Otherwise, they're just going to run amok and potentially even stab their officers. None of that is borne out by fact. The statistical analysis has been done. We do know as verifiable fact that the biggest proportion of Wellington's army is in fact from the labouring classes. We also know that actually a proportion of the British Army is elevated from the ranks into the officer corps. So they clearly weren't sufficiently scum that they couldn't be utilised to command these men. We also know that Wellington turns around and says, the army has met with no privations. And actually, we know from the soldiers' accounts, from their own words, they were literally starving and feeding themselves off of acorns that they found in the woods. There are times when Wellington is completely disconnected from the reality. And that is a surprise. That is part of the reason that we raise it, because actually we expect so much more of Wellington in terms of the mythos, in terms of how we talk about his attention to detail with supply. There are moments when he screws this up. And that's not to say that Wellington doesn't have a decent handle on his army. Part of the reason that he wins battles is because he makes very carefully calculated assessments of what will lead to victory and circumstances and scenarios in which an attack is smart and in which actually being on the defensive is the shrewder move, or actually not fighting the battle at all is the shrewder move. But it is okay for us to turn around and say at times Wellington is disconnected because we actually have the much bigger picture. Wellington in a given moment has any number of pressures and emotions that influence his judgments. We can strip some of the emotion out of that and look a little bit more dispassionately and really kind of dig into these figures and use things like spreadsheets and tools that weren't available to Wellington and his staff to actually look at the truth. Now, sure, Wellington had these perceptions, but perception and reality is always a hugely different thing. There is, so I was the one who kind of made the point that there isn't a single battle on which everything hinges. Sure, if Wellington gets cut up, let's say at Fuente d'Onora, which is the one which realistically is probably the closest, what happens then? Well, there's a big question mark about whether or not he can get across the Coa. But even if that army is annihilated, is it Britain's only army? Not really. Wellington does say this is the last Britain army has, and I need to take care of it. That is well established. I've said it many times on this show. It shows his inclination to be careful with his men's lives. But is that actually verifiable fact? Well, the fact that the British are able to send reinforcements to Wellington, that they bolster Wellington's forces over 1811, 1812 into 1813, the fact that the British Army then deploys forces to the New World for the War of 1812, the fact that Britain has a contingent in Northern Europe during the 1813-14 campaign, the fact that Britain has forces deployed in India, the fact that Britain is a multi-continental empire shows that Britain has other forces that can be used. And sure, being eviscerated during the Peninsular War would have had an impact on Britain's military capacity. But in terms of the wider stakes of what's going on, it comes back to this point that there are other places where the British can be deployed, and there are other armies in this fight. And a lot of what Britain is really doing during this period is bankrolling. So sure, this could have been disastrous for Wellington, but therein lies sort of the end of it. And the proof of that, I would suggest, is with what happens in 1809, with the debacle that is the Corinna retreat. You know, there are other options that Britain can and does utilize. Now, sure, what does this mean for the Peninsular War? It potentially makes it very, very complicated, but there is a Portuguese army that the British are training up. There are Spanish armies. Now, sure, we make many comments about the quality of them, but it's not as though Britain is the only force or that Wellington is the only army at play here. So I would kind of argue, I would stand by my guns. You do make some very good and very pertinent arguments, and I'm not dismissing them. I'm just saying that fundamentally I don't agree. And actually, some of the guys that we're about to turn to may agree with you more, and that's fine. So, gents, let me throw it over to you guys. What's your take? Where would you argue this one?
I want to start with the sort of the bit about the sort of implicit argument that critics know about the quality and capability of Wellington's troops, and it was something that I thought about. And similar to yourself, Zach, I was initially coming down on the kind of that statistical point of view, right? That kind of that all primary source collation of evidence, and whilst I agree with that, I also think there's a blood and guts element here, right? That we can never really understand. Dare I say, we weren't there, so we'll never know. But there is an element of that at play here, and I think that's where Peter Webb, wasn't it, is leaning. I think it's that kind of that real blood and guts, that kind of looking a person in the eye and feeling that relationship firsthand. And I think that's where this person is going with this, and in that sense, he's right. We can never feel that. Now, in terms of the battle stuff, the sort of key battle, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think there is anything that could happen in the peninsula to a certain degree that isn't undoable. And like you say, I don't want to be too harsh, of course, because Wellington said it, and it is a sort of, it's a conceived idea that this army is the only army that Britain has. And at the time, it's the best army that Britain has, undoubtedly the best army that Britain has. It's well trained, it's well motivated, it's well officered. But it isn't the only. I mean, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but there are tens of thousands of British troops or troops in British service across the globe that can be employed in the sort of the defense of the empire, for want of a better phrase. I think sometimes we look at Wellington and then we see a bunch of dudes in red coats. Like how far Wellington is removed from a private soldier on the front line. And I don't necessarily mean just geographically, but in terms of levels of command and sort of, and just those sort of handshakes down, it's so far that actually it's way more complicated than just Wellington and his scum of the earth, for want of a better phrase.
I think the better thing here is not that this is Britain's only army, or that that's it. The thing is that if he is defeated, there is a good chance that people who are anti the war or anti the peninsula will block another army being sent to where he is. Can Britain field another army if necessary? Yes. But whether or not it's going to happen or not is a different question. Look, he makes a very good point, right? About this is how the battles progress, right? This is how the battles progress. We can't definitively say that if one was a failure, then the others would have occurred or not, etc., etc. So yes, they are all building blocks. They are all dominoes in the move. I'm with you, Zach and Liam, on modern historians, sources, etc., knowing, understanding the conditions of the average soldier. Ed Koss enters the chat yet again. Hi, Ed. We know you're listening. We love you. It's complicated. It always is. I will say fundamentally that I consider the lines of Torres Vedras to be a brilliant tactical and strategic move. That's not a last resort retreat. That is a brilliant piece of logistics and over our battlefield maneuverability that completely pulls the rug out of the French army, who have no idea what to do when that sort of comes across the horizon, and they're like, okay, we don't know. So, but other than that, I mean, this is again, it's on both sides. Wellington does a good job in the peninsula, especially with what he's given, and as Liam said, it is Britain's best trained army at that time. And fair play to him. He also, listen, if this is Britain's only army, is what he needs to say to get it into the heads of his officers to not waste his men's lives, then or get into the head of people of Whitehall that army needs to be supported, then he's going to do that. The man, for all that he throws, giant snits, and for all that he is a little bit of a prima donna, he knows how to use language, and he knows how to use diplomacy and politics that well to get his army, not so much what he wants, he'd love a lot more than he ever gets, but to get it what it can get, what he is capable of squeezing out of the stone that is Parliament.
Yeah, Wellington might not be a master propagandist, but he's a master of language, and he's a master of applying pressure. He's very good at identifying those pressure points and utilizing them, as we've talked about in the past. So we are probably going to call it a halt there, but I do just want to give a shout out to Arthur on Spotify. Thank you to everybody, of course, who made comments. Inevitably with these things, we don't have time to go through everybody's contributions, but Arthur said, really enjoys listening. More of a question than a comment. It's nice to have it the other way around for a change. How would Napoleon and Wellington have performed with each other's subordinates? Could Wellington have controlled or influenced the marshals better? And who would have been Napoleon's marshals if he had to pick from the Allied/British officer corps? Now, we alluded to this earlier on, but in the interest of actually giving this the level of thought that it deserves, what I think we'll do is we'll do an exclusive episode on this for our patrons, because I think this is a really kind of rich question and a really fun one. So, Arthur, many thanks for the comment. You have encouraged us to commission an episode on exactly that. So keep an eye out. It'll be available to the people who are subscribers through Spotify or who are on our Patreon listings, either as the exploring officers, the mentioned in dispatches patrons, or the admirals, or indeed in the crown yourself tier. Gents, any final comments before we wrap up?
History and memory matters. How we shape things matter.
Possibly Luke's most evergreen comment ever. But, we don't call him Dr. Memory for nothing. Gents, it's been a pleasure as always. Thank you for your thoughts and erudite and good-natured discussion on all of this. And thank you once again to our commenters, whether they are on Patreon, Spotify, Facebook, Twitter, or indeed YouTube. This has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Folks, you know the drill. We will be back very soon. Did you enjoy this episode? If so, be sure to subscribe so that you can find your way back to us, and leave us a comment if you're on Spotify or YouTube, and you never know, we might feature it in a future episode. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, then sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, and much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in early November 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mars Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramus, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Peter Findlay, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, Wojciech Stefanovic, Zach Johnson, Simon Weathers, and John C. The Admirals: Ian Harding, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, Darla Vincent, Rob Painter, Kate Walcombe, Simon, David Maxwell, Adam Coslin, JC Kaiser, Brian Silicate, Clemens Beman, and Dan Hazelwood. And in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell, the Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell, Paltry Prince of Pukalani Bob Burnham, First Lord of the Treasury Ryan Diamond, and General Alexander Zuvorov Seth Hansen. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of Liam, Luke, and Louis, and myself, of course, take care of yourself, folks. Stay well, stay nerdy, and as always, thank you for listening.